Lesson 2.2, Colonial America. In this lesson, we're going to look at the colonial period in North and South America after the discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus. We're going to primarily focus on the three major colonizers: Spain, Spain, France, and Great Britain. We're also going to make special note of Brazil, which was settled by the Portuguese, but then also New Amsterdam, which was settled by the Dutch, which would later become New York City. Now, to begin, we got to look at the Spanish colonial American holdings. Spain would control all the territory from the southwest parts of modern-day United States, that would be Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, all the way through the Caribbean islands, Central America, and all the way down the western coast of South America, where Brazil would be settled by Portugal due to a treaty or agreement with Spain. Now, the Spanish at first would extract gold and other precious materials from the Aztec, the Inca, and the Maya civilization. But once that easy gold was stolen from those civilizations, they turned to mining, primarily silver, where they would enslave Native Americans to work quite literally to death for those materials. Now, once the Native American population was being depleted because they were dying in the silver mines, or they were quite literally dying from diseases brought by the Spanish, they turned to importing African slaves. Now, the French would colonize what is modern-day Canada, the area around the Mississippi River, and the area around the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence. The French did not create large settlements. As a matter of fact, they only built a few forts. Some of them actually were quite impressive, but they never would build large cities or towns, much like the British would. Instead, the French would focus on fur trading. They would trade with the Native Americans for the very valuable furs that they could often catch in the wild, and then the French traders would take it back to Europe and sell for a pretty decent profit. Now, the first European settlers to Illinois would actually be two Frenchmen, a fur trader named Jacques Marquette and a Catholic missionary named Louis Joliet. Now, the British had a pretty unique history in the New World as well. They were kind of late on the game. They were beaten there by the Spanish and then by the French, and they had a lot tougher time. They weren't able to find gold like the Spanish, so they had a harder time with digging for precious metals. And they weren't as successful in the fur trade, just mainly because they didn't have as good a relationship with Native Americans. So instead, they switched to primarily farming and extracting other raw materials from the land. The first attempt to settle North America by the British or the English was in 1585, and it failed spectacularly. It was the colony of Roanoke in modern-day Virginia. And it ultimately was unsuccessful after a couple of years, when all of these settlers essentially disappeared. With even today, we really don't know what happened to them. Now, the first successful colony would have been Jamestown. Jamestown was settled by the British, and it was supposed to be a mining town. They hoped that they could find gold and precious metals like the Spanish. They brought mining tools and tests rather than equipment for farming, and so as a result, they found themselves in a state of starvation fairly quickly. This period became known as the starvation time, mainly because a lot of them were unwilling to work and farm. A lot of them didn't even have the skills because they were miners. And instead, they fell to eating shoes and leather and rats and horses, pretty much anything you get their hands on. And sadly, some even turned to cannibalism. There's some evidence to suggest cannibalism took place. Now, John Smith, the guy made popular in Disney's Pocahontas, he was at Jamestown, although he was much older than he was depicted in the movie. And he had absolutely no romantic relationship with Pocahontas whatsoever. She was a very young girl and only mentioned once or twice in his diary, from his time at Jamestown. He would kind of get the Jamestown colony into shape, and living by the rule, he who does not work, neither shall he eat. Now, later it's going to be John Rolfe that actually marries Pocahontas. He's going to bring stolen tobacco seeds to Jamestown and be very successful at growing tobacco and then shipping it back to the Americas. With that wealth, he ends up actually buying a few slaves and becoming fairly successful, at least financially. Now, in 1619, a Portuguese trading ship arrived at Jamestown and sought to trade with the Jamestown colonists. Among many things sold and bought by these Portuguese, one of the things that Jamestown gained access to was 20 African slaves from Angola. So the Jamestown settlers bought these slaves, technically labeled as indentured servants. Under the current law or under the law at that point, they didn't really have legal slavery. It wasn't necessarily illegal, but instead they called them indentured servants, which basically meant you were contracted workers, you weren't paid. But the idea was theoretically someday you would be set free. It is true that some of these Africans were eventually set free. However, within about 20 to 25 years, a series of laws were passed where basically they made slavery hereditary, where once you were a slave, you were a slave until your death, and your children were then put into slavery. Um, it should be noted that although a lot of these individuals were technically indentured servants, legally, or at least I guess you could say, it was essentially slavery. It was slavery under a different name. And then over time, slavery became much more darker and much more sinister than it sounds, I guess, on paper. But the condition of slavery definitely settled in fairly quickly after the colonists kind of figured out where slavery would fit in the grand scheme of things. These slaves would work in the tobacco fields, and then later on, they would be used elsewhere on the colony. It should be stated, though, that slavery mainly is something that affects the southern parts of the colonies. I mean, it does definitely spread up north, but in the southern parts of the colonies, like Virginia, Maryland, Georgia, and the Carolinas, slavery becomes a major part of the economy for the British colonies. Now, another group, and I'm sure you've heard quite a bit about the Pilgrims, was the Plymouth colony. Now, the Pilgrims left England primarily because of religious persecution. They were called Puritans. They sought to purify the Anglican Church, and because of that, they were kind of social and religious outcasts. They wandered around England and then later in the Netherlands until finally they realized that, well, actually, their children were not growing up as Puritans. So they decided they're going to have to get someplace and kind of set up their own religious community. So they more or less rented or contracted a boat named the Mayflower. They actually hired John Smith to kind of give them some advice along the way, and then they set out for the New World. They were originally destined for Virginia, but they never made it. Instead, they were forced to essentially set up their colony in Plymouth, which is actually Massachusetts. Quite a bit different of a climate than they were hoping for. Much cooler and not as conducive for farming. Now, on November 11th, 1620, they agreed to what's called the Mayflower Compact, which was a document that set out a democratic form of government where the Pilgrims would essentially govern themselves, which was a fairly new concept for any place in the world, much less the colonies. Now, their government allowed adult male colonists to vote and elect a governor and a council that would create laws. The Pilgrims hoped to establish laws that actually would benefit everyone. It should be noted that women, most minorities, and were not allowed to vote, though, in this kind of situation. But at least it was a step in the right direction. Now, life in the colonies was actually not bad if you could survive the initial settling period or those first few decades. One of my jokes I always kind of say, if you're going to go to Mars someday, just make sure you're not the first person to go to Mars. But the American colonists were on average 2 inches taller, mainly because the farmland allowed them to grow more and better food. Colonist children were twice as likely to make it to adulthood, and they were more likely to be able to read and write. Now, it should be said, colonists actually paid fewer taxes to the British government. Just don't tell anyone who was at the Boston Tea Party. They paid fewer taxes, probably because it was just harder to get the taxes to Britain, and it was harder to enforce tax laws. Now, farming dominated the colonies. Pretty much everyone was a farmer. If you were a lawyer, a doctor, a farmer, if you were a miner, if you were pretty much had any profession, you were also a farmer kind of on the side. They learned that lesson early on to grow their own food. Now, the middle colonies would actually start building ships and they would engage in merchant trade, while the middle colonies, those a little bit further south, would engage in farming, primarily grain crops, wheat, barley, and rye. And the southern colonies would rely heavily on African slavery. The cool thing is that all the colonies, for the most part, develop a representative government where they're allowed to make their own rules and vote.